So I started as an experimentalist, which I have a different background from everybody here, which was interesting the last day and a half, thinking I am like nobody else in this room. So I am more of a climate scientist. Some people said we need a physicist here, we need the perspective of a physicist. But even among climate scientists, I started, and I still am, in observations, like in specific measurements. So I come from a tradition that's not even the modeling tradition, which is a little weird. So when I listened to everybody talking, I thought, the talk I was going to give, which is just our research results, which is mostly statistics, and people here are doing machine learning and computation, that's not even the right talk. So what I should do is, people kept saying, I want the perspective of someone else, I should give that perspective. Like Alex did such a great job of giving a sort of philosophical perspective talk on the first day. So now I've kind of have too much material. I put in like a half an hour of my perspective and then bang, bang, half an hour of research results, just flashing things so that people can not understand and be annoyed and then go read the paper later. And then maybe we can talk about sort of collaborations and sort of intersections with straight computation. Okay, so how did I get into all this? I've always been interested in policy. When I came to the University of Chicago, there suddenly was this amazing opportunity to raise a bunch of money for a center that brought together climate, computation, statistics, economics, and policy. We thought we were going to get a huge sum of money from MacArthur. We weren't, but then we got a big sum of money from NSF. So we're in the 7th year of that now. It should run, hopefully, if NSF doesn't cancel it, which of course we never know, through 2019. It would be from that time period a total of 12 million. A lot of that goes to econ, straight econ, but a lot of it has gone to climate. And within this collaboration, that sort of set off my whole interest in climate statistics. We also have another program that I want to tell you guys about because we just got confirmation that we got funded for one of these NRT programs by NSF, which is a graduate training program, but they demand that you transform graduate education. And we said what we really want is we want to train students who work in environmental sciences to have techniques that they don't get in their current training. Our climate science students take no statistics, no computation, right? They'll learn to program in MATLAB. They know how to work with big data sets. They don't really know what to do with that data. And what we're seeing over and over again is that as the volume of data increases, we run into these limitations. We can't produce papers that say, here's observations, here's my model, here's 2 pictures, they kind of look the same. Now that being said, I'm going to show a lot of those kind of pictures in this slide, but in this talk. But the point is we have to get beyond that, and our students aren't trained sufficiently. And so this project is called, infuses their food, energy, water systems, which we interpreted as climate, computational data science to advance research at the energy environment nexus. And one of the reasons that may be interesting to you guys is that as part of this center, the students who are participating, and they want many more students than are directly funded, so hopefully it'll be a bigger program, will take boot camps in techniques and statistics and computational techniques in September, and then they take a 2-quarter practicum class where they're working in interdisciplinary groups on data sets related to climate, energy, food, and water, with mentoring by somebody. And so we're looking for people who have a data set and a great problem and say, wouldn't it be great if 4 students from different backgrounds all worked on this data set to answer this question that I have been thinking about but don't have time for? So anybody who wants to participate in that program by being a faculty mentor, that would be awesome, right? And we want people from all different backgrounds. So we imagine that those students are mostly going to be geosci, social science. A lot of social science students are interested, some computation, and then master's students in statistics from our master's program, because it allows that. So we should have a good mix. Some of you guys went to the SAMC Statistics and Climate Workshop this year, or the Rossby Palooza Climate and Statistics Workshop that we had at UChicago last year. And we're hoping to take the hackathon kind of thing that we did for a week and do it for 2 quarters and make sure it comes out as a paper at the end. That's the goal of all that. Okay, so that being said, why did we get involved through this in climate statistics? The way we started thinking about this problem is that the human system is incredibly important for all these decision-making issues that we need to resolve as a society. The actual way that the modeling has gone between these fields looks like this. The human system models were incredibly simple. The climate models were incredibly complex. The human system models didn't even need all this complexity from the climate models. They were overwhelmed by it, but they were also kind of impressed by it. So they wanted to put humans into the climate model. And I said, that is so wrong. And then run a simulation that takes you 3 months when all your people equations are super simple. Don't worry about us. Work on the human side and let us give you something simple from the climate side. That's whatever you need. we'll figure out how to extract it from the climate models and understand what the climate models are really telling you. So we got interested in this problem of, the econ people, we said, please make more complex representation of human systems. We wanted to make less complex representation of the climate system. So how do we use the fancy numerical simulations we have to give us information that doesn't require that computational load? It doesn't mean we need the numerical system perhaps to understand the climate system, but it doesn't mean that we then need to run it every single time, right? The climate system is not arbitrary. And so if you already have done some runs, you have some information about the climate system that you can work into a reduced form model. So that's the goal, is to make reduced form models. Okay, so before I discuss this model emulation, which was kind of my main goal, I felt like I needed to say some things that gave my perspective. When I came up as an experimenter, the mantra we were always told is experimenters disbelieve all experiments but believe all models. And modelers disbelieve all models but believe all experiments, right? Because you always believe what the other person has. But then I kind of felt like in this room, the climate scientists believe all the models and the experiments. And actually, they shouldn't believe any of it, right? So let's get appropriately skeptical and figure out what information we really have. So I'm going to give this perspective stuff, and most of it, I'm sure, is stuff you already know. So I'm hoping it's not totally useless, because at least I'm curating this set of simple stuff I'm saying, so you can say, okay, this is what she thinks is important, and maybe the fact that I think this stuff is important is useful, even if it's probably already pieces of the bigger subset of stuff you know about the climate system. So think of this as the reduced form version of the climate system that I'm giving you to try to distill. Okay, so I want to answer these questions that I've really felt like were missing from the discussion before. So what is climate? This is the climate informatics session. Like, what is climate? What is a question about climate? What is a climate model? And what is the climate model good for? Like, these are kind of like, I want to start with these things because they seem kind of important. So let's start with what is climate, which, and here, I was going to go, now I'm on a different computer. I don't know, is there a tech person here? Can we go to the web? Do you guys know this particular graphical interface? Some of you know it. What I really want to do is go to the actual website and show you this. So let's see if I can get there. And this is online. Will it be online? Now it's going to, I don't want it to go to Google Hangouts. I want it to just give me a window. earth.nullschool.net. I thought I was doing this on my own computer. If I'm not connected, it's not totally the end of the world, but it would be really nice to show you this. It's fine. So what this is a visualization. Can I just log in? It's on VPN. Should I go into log in on guest? It's on VPN clients. Should I do anything else? I mean, it says it's connected, but it's not loading anything. Oh, there it goes. Okay. All right. So this is a wonderful visualization, and we're actually trying to get some computer science students to adapt this so we can project climate model in the same framework. So because it's such a good visualization. So I'm just going to go here and show you. So this is, we can also rotate this guy to any direction we want. Right now it's showing you temperatures, and then there's an overlay of winds. It's daily averages. It's not showing you dynamical information. It's just representing the winds in a fancy way. We can go up in altitudes. That's surface, basically surface, near surface air. Higher up, people talked about the jet stream. Now we can see this jet stream here. There is the dynamics that are caused by the jet stream. We can go back in time. So that's an interesting question. Like, people said, we kept talking about information sets. So like, what is this stuff? What do you think it is? What is it likely to be? So people were talking about variability in the jet stream. This is the jet stream varying, right? You can see it makes this is showing you temperature gradients. So the wind and the temperature are highly correlated. The jet stream is encircling that, and the whole area is wiggling with these planetary scale waves. Like, now you look at this, you can see exactly what's going on. The eye and the brain are really good statistical tools. So some people said, I don't understand why there's anti-correlation on 10-day timescales. It's because of this, right? Because these waves are just migrating around. We can also look at other things. So this is, you can see that wind and temperature, we're up at 700 millibars. It's even more clear at 500 millibars now. Let's look at relative humidity. Oh, that's kind of correlated too, right? So all of these things seem connected. This is 3 HPA is 3-hour precipitable water. At least it has more structure, but maybe some connection. Total precipitable water is water vapor. Again, you know, there's all these things that clearly these variables are correlated with each other. They have complex spatiotemporal structures. They're evolving in space and time. It is not a simple statistical problem. None of this is white noise, right? So when we look at the actual system, so now I'm going to go back. I love this display, and I really hope that people go back to it. And now I have to find the actual presentation again. Where is it? It must be here. Okay, so this is a dynamical system of multiple interacting variables with complex spatiotemporal dependence. It's a really hard problem statistically. It's not something that statistics has been set up to look at. Okay, so what was that? Somebody asked the wonderful question, what was that data? It's just numbers, right? So all of these numbers that look great and they're on a grid, like what are they actually? Where do they come from? Like numbers emerge from somewhere and they have uncertainties and problems associated with them. So I wanted to list the information sources we have about climate. So the first thing are observations. We have in situ observations, like measurements at a certain place of a variable right there in one location. That's an in situ observation. It can have its own observational uncertainty. Rain gauges are not perfect. They get dumped. They misread. But it is probably the closest thing we have to a true measurement, but they're sparse. They're not equally sampled. You almost never see a data set of actual observations. So what do you see? Sometimes we have remote sensing observations, which is a measurement at a distance inferred from a retrieval from a satellite usually, and it's usually from radiant, some kind of electromagnetic radiation coming back to the sensor on the satellite. And then from that, you retrieve often data over a very large spatial extent, like a profile in the atmosphere. So it's also an observation, but it's an indirect one. It depends on your retrieval algorithm. There's a whole other set of uncertainties associated with that. Anybody who's worked with satellite data discovers like, oh, version 4 doesn't look like version 3, and yet it's the same observation, right? So observations are themselves not perfect. Satellite measurements are also not uniform across the globe. You don't have a perfect view of everything at any time. And you guys should all know that in the future, we're going to have even fewer observations because our satellite observation systems are going away. So all of this climate observation stuff is going to be worse. And our weather stations are reducing in number. Okay, so what you typically see is something called a data product. What is a data product? It's kind of data and it's kind of not data. And it's really important to not call these things, everything data. So a data product is usually derived from one or more data sources, and it's usually interpolated on a grid. So it's kind of nice. It looks tractable, it's easier to work with, it's on a grid. But we don't have actual measurements on that grid. So what did we do? Well, maybe we just did a statistical interpolation of sparse data, and it's all buried in there. You don't know how they did it. Some of our precip data is horribly spatially interpolated, so it looks like it's drizzling in between weather stations all the time because they've just done a really crude interpolation. Which is completely wrong. Often what we have is something that is basically interpolated by a model. So we take a numerical simulation, which is a complex set of equations that's supposed to represent physical processes, and then we shove and force it to match the observations as well as it can to find the best fit solution. So it will not drive itself exactly through every observations because they're in conflict, but it will find the optimal solution to minimize the discrepancies. That's usually what you're looking at, something that's been interpolated by a model. So these are not pure, nothing is pure here. Numerical models, simulations. So when I say a simulation, I mean a model which is run forward in time. So it's the same kind of model but run forward. An operational model is run for a short time. What you actually see in that is not observation, it's a short-term 6-hour forecast. So it's interpolating, it's inputting, it's simulating observations and running 6 hours ahead and making a nice gridded something that looks like reality but isn't quite reality. And the important thing about operational models is that they're initialized from observations, they're tied to the observations. So what is the distinction to a climate model? A climate model is run for long term and it's run so far forward that it forgets its initial conditions. An operational model exactly depends on its initial conditions. It's trying to tell you what will happen next. A climate model is trying to forget the initial conditions you gave it, which are probably wrong. And so it's trying to represent something like a probability distribution rather than an actual state. I'm also going to talk about reduced form models. A statistical model is an empirical representation of relationship between variables, something that I've just made up that fits some fraction of the variability. Or an analytical model, which our dynamicists love, which are a set of physically based equations, and then they tune them to match the observations. And again, you can ask, they tune parameters, whether this accounts for a large fraction of the variation. So all of these things are information that sort of people use and that gets mixed up here, and they're totally different, and they have different problems associated with them, and none of them are perfect. That's the really important thing to realize. Okay, so climate. Why do we say the Earth has a climate but not the moon? This is, I started using this analog when I talked to all kinds of people in the public to say, look, what is climate? Climate is something we describe on the Earth. We don't talk about the moon's climate, right? Why not? Well, of course, but still, it's a system. It's a system. So there's something different about the system that somehow we don't even use the word climate to describe it. There's no atmosphere and there's no ocean. So right away we say, well, all these things, atmospheric and ocean variables are kind of what we describe for climate, and there isn't an atmosphere and ocean on the moon, so therefore there's no climate. But climate is also surface temperature, and the moon has a surface temperature. So why don't we describe the climate of the moon's surface temperature? And the answer is, well, it does have variations, but it's really boring. This is the moon's surface temperature at the equator, and it does this every day, always. And what it does is it does incredibly huge changes by 200 degrees Kelvin between the lunar day and the lunar night. Basically, if you stand on the moon under the sun, you fry to death. And then if you stand on the moon on the night side, you freeze to death, right? So you cannot go on the moon without a spacesuit that has thermal protection. The moon has wild, enormous temperature changes. But why isn't that a climate? Because it's absolutely deterministic. Because the surface temperature of the moon is just set by interaction with the sun. Whatever's shining on it, it will get into almost. I mean, it has a little bit of residual insulation from the rock here. But the temperature on the moon is set by the amount of incoming radiation. Is that the Earth? No, here's the Earth. It's the same distance from the moon. It gets the same insulation. So what does it look like, the temperature range at the equator of the Earth? It looks like that on a day and that over a year. So that's what the atmosphere does. So you say, oh, the atmosphere doesn't make it more variable. That's weird. The atmosphere seems to make it less variable, but more unpredictable, right? So it's doing something. It's homogenizing temperature. It's making it warmer. That's the mean temperature of Antarctica, which is above the moon's mean temperature is below the mean temperature of Antarctica. So the Earth is on average warmer, and it somehow has less range of variation, but less predictability. So why is that happening? And what is it doing? What is the whole point of this thing we call climate? So climate is the processes in the atmosphere and ocean by which heat is transported to achieve energy balance. That's what I would call the fundamental properties. It's how a physicist would think about it. So we have incoming radiation. The fundamental part of the Earth is that it's warmed at the surface and has to get rid of that energy at altitude. That's the core physical property, because the atmosphere is transparent to visible radiation, almost, not perfectly, and it's not transparent to infrared. So somehow we have to move energy to where it can get out. And all of the climate system is devoted to moving energy to where it can get out. And that means energy has to be moved up in the atmosphere, and then it's typically moved polewards where there's less water vapor, and so it's less infrared opaque, and it can radiate there. So it wants to radiate from altitude, and it wants to radiate at the poles, and the atmosphere and ocean are busy moving heat around so that the Earth can have balance. And it's just a dynamical system, and if it's out of balance, it will try to restore itself to balance. It's not in balance at any given moment. It's kind of on balance on average over a year, but it's wildly out of balance month to month, right? So if you look at the seasonal cycle, you do not see perfect energy balance, and it's certainly not in balance at any given place because it's moving heat from equator to poles. What we're talking about when we talk about CO2 forcing is a small change, an increase in that opacity, which makes the atmosphere and ocean have to do more of what they're already doing, right? It's harder to get rid of the heat. They have to do more of whatever they're doing, which is move it up and move it out. So, but we're looking at tiny changes on a system that's already mostly doing a huge amount for us already. So the reason I really want to emphasize this is that that's what climate models were designed to do, is to calculate this energy balance. Now we're asking them to do a lot more than that. And some of that they do pretty well, but this is what they were designed for, is to say, how do I how does the system come into energy balance? And now we ask them to do all kinds of things like predict vegetation changes and crazy stuff like that. Okay, so climate versus weather definitions. This is the climate informatics workshop, but I think half the talks were on weather. So people in climate science have a really, maybe an arbitrarily large distinction between climate and weather, and we're trying to, now that our models are getting higher resolution, we have to have these communities come together. But in the old days, when I was a grad student, a climate scientist would never talk to a meteorologist. They were totally different people in different communities. So this room has more connection between climate and weather than you usually see in the actual fields. So why is that so? It's because the Earth system is chaotic. So a small change will quickly produce statistically independent states. And quickly, we typically assume it's on 10 years. That's not strictly true because there's some long-term dependence. So if you try to look at, you initialize a climate model with slightly different, even flipping a bit, right? It'll be mostly independent after 10 years, but then, you check it against what would happen if you have two initializations 100 years apart, and there is some dependence still after 10, but mostly they're independent, and that's the common assumption. The atmosphere forgets its initial state quite quickly. So what does that mean? When you do a long-term simulation, you've forgotten the initial state. So climate, I would say, is the joint probability distribution of ocean and atmospheric variables. So it's a probability distribution. It expresses a characteristic of the system. Weather is a particular realization of that system. Weather is what happens tomorrow. Climate is the probability distribution of what could happen, right? And so those communities have traditionally been totally separate, partly because they're asking different questions. Okay, so what is a climate question? Climate versus weather questions. A traditional weather question has been, what will happen tomorrow, the next day, 4 days out, 5 days out? Because people cared. The weather people didn't have to justify why they cared about what climate was 5 days out. Maybe they had to pick a metric that mattered, like I really care about rainfall, is it average rainfall or maximum rainfall or rainfall over this flood basin? They had to make some decisions about what they were trying to predict, but they didn't have to justify the need to predict something. That was what people were asking from them. So a weather forecast question is simply what will happen over a certain time scale, and that's fine. They don't have to be more philosophical about it. So people want the answer, whether people are trying to answer it. They can develop algorithms to produce a prediction, and those algorithms are statistically testable because you have different weather all the time, and you can test how good your algorithm is in your skill score. And machine learning is awesome for this because you're trying to make an answer, and you can test the validity of that answer, and you're not going into deeper, you don't have to have any sort of deep conversation about why you're asking this question in the first place. So this is a very easy and obvious not easy, but it's an obvious application of machine learning algorithms, is make this better and I can test it with a skill score. Okay, climate questions could perhaps be similar. You could say, I want to ask the same question about climate. Now, climate is not the realization, it's the probability distribution. So I can say, what will the probability distribution be like in the future? That is, we don't call that a forecast because we're so cautious that we're not really as good as weather people, so let's give it a different name. So we call it a projection. And we're very certain to call it a projection because we don't want to be held to the same standards. But the thing about that is two things. First, if there's not any external bumping of the system, the probability distribution won't change. So those kind of future questions depend on an external forcing. They're only valid questions if you say, how will a probability distribution change given something external that happens? And here's the kind of external things you can ask: a change in the input energy, the solar insolation from orbital forcing, or maybe from crazy radiative engineering, or a change in the infrared opacity, which comes from adding CO2 or other greenhouse gases. So we're saying we do some change in the fundamental characteristics that affect energy balance, and then we want to see how the probability distribution changes. That's a valid question, but it's a really sucky question for grad students and postdocs, and even worse for faculty, because it takes forever to test the hypothesis. It's a falsifiable hypothesis that takes decades to test. People don't want to ask science questions that their grandchildren will answer. So it is a scientific question, but it's not a comfortable one to put your career on. So we make projections, and it's important to make them, but that can't be the only thing we're doing, because otherwise the field would be really boring. The other reason is that models are kind of problematic for the level of detail that we want to know. And again, we don't get to test it for several decades. So what climate scientists think of as questions are not just forecasts. Although it's true the field is a little bit too much into using models as crystal balls, which they shouldn't be. But there are other questions we should be asking. So asking climate questions for insight and understanding. So it was kind of cool that Alex's talk came in the morning because he had these ideas that weren't what I would think of, but they were also valid ideas. His idea number one was a question that's about insight and understanding is causality. Like, does A lead to B? So you have to define what A is and B is. But the concept of causality is really problematic in an unforced system. It's just a dynamical system where everything's adjusting together to reach an equilibrium state. Like, you can't really say what causes what. You can maybe say something leads or that they're correlated, but there is no causality in a state which is just internally variable, right? So causality only works when you have a forcing, which is also fine to say I want to understand the causality of CO2. That's totally fine, but it's more restricted. His other idea was attribution. Is observation A much more probable given a particular external forcing? So it's also a forcing question. So that's also a valid question and a really important one right now, but it's not going to be important in 10 years. So grad students in this room, like, this question will get really boring really quickly because eventually these changes will be obvious. Once they're obvious, the whole field of attribution goes away. Yeah. So it's complicated. Yeah, like, how do I decide what external is? So this is essentially what people think of as external. Like, and this is people. So we say, oh, any sort of change in the population of plankton in the ocean is not external, but something that people do is external. But we're also living creatures, so why do we get to be special? But that's just how it is, right? So it's either insulation changes from, zooming around differently, the Earth's orbit tilts, the orbit changes, or the axis tilts, or it's people have done something, and that's a little bit arbitrary. And plankton count as natural variability, and people don't. Cows that are there because of people count as an external forcing. I'm just telling you, it's, all of these things. Yeah, of course. Yeah, so that's why I was thinking about it. I was like, what is an external forcing? Oh, that's interesting. This is like people things. Okay, so attribution is really important right now. It becomes less interesting over time. We totally should do it, but people shouldn't build a career on it because eventually these changes get huge and then people stop caring about your statistical tests because it's kind of obvious to everybody anecdotally. So a common question in climate science is, can a reduced form model explain a large fraction of observed behavior? That's what we call insight, And that's a kind of a weird definition of insight. It's like, I want to have a really complicated system, and then I want to say a simpler system will work fine to explain that. But that's what we think of as insight. When we have that, we say we understand something. So I have another slide on machine learning later. It can lend itself to this, but it's important to think of how machine learning can connect to this idea that what I'm trying to find is a simpler explanation for a system. And that's what I really felt like I wanted to say this morning. That's the connection we have to make, is how do I take this complicated computational approach and help us learn how to make a simple model that reproduces the complicated model. Okay, so here's a super simple explanation that is like very trivial, and everybody probably knows this already, but this is the distribution of precipitation, annual it's the average of all precipitation, millimeters per day, over more than 10 years from the TRMM satellite, which is not perfect, but it's pretty good, in the tropics and subtropics, because TRMM doesn't measure further out. And you see lots of precip around the equator, and then you see these big dry spots here, desert, desert, more desert, more desert, more desert, right? So there's a clear spatial pattern. What kind of explanation can I construct that explains that spatial pattern that doesn't require me to run a huge simulation? I say, oh, look, the air is going up at the equator. As it goes up, the rain comes out, and then it descends, and when it descends, it's dry, and therefore I have wet here and dry on both sides. That's a reduced form explanation that explains not all of the variability, but a big part of it. And when we know that, we say we have insight and understanding. So it's a conceptual model that gives us at least some characteristics of the spatial pattern or the temporal variability. Okay, so what is a climate model? So one of the problems with studying the climate is it's really hard to work from observations. We don't have a lot of them. We don't have stationary states. We don't really understand how the forcing has changed because we don't know how the aerosols have changed. There's limited information, so we can't project out. We can't extrapolate beyond sample from our observations. That's statistically really dangerous. So a lot of these studies happen in numerical simulations, which is really weird and really dangerous. Wasn't the case, 30 years ago. Students actually measured things Now they all look inside a computer screen and say, I'm understanding the world, which is weird. So what is a climate model? It's a system of equations that describes radiation, describes motion. That's all it started as. And now we've added a lot of other things, parameterized processes that represent things that happen below the spatial scale of the model. So this is the core, like the radiation balance and then the motion of air and ocean. And you can do a whole energy balance solution from just these, but that leaves out everything to do with moist physics and clouds and precipitation, which is pretty big, right? The clouds are a huge, huge climate signal. So people have to stuff them in. And then they start stuffing all kinds of other stuff in. So what has changed in the past? These equations are basically the same. The computer science people make them run faster and more efficiently, which is great. We changed the resolution. This was AR5, the fifth assessment was using models that were basically these resolutions. We're going down to this resolution. Those are still much larger than the scale of a convective system, which is a few kilometers. So we cannot represent this one thing, which represents the major uncertainty on the Earth system and the dominant source of uncertainty between climate models. See, I had another slide here that vanished. Just this one is just a UCAR slide to say what happened in climate modeling. We just started adding, besides making the resolution better, we started adding more and more stuff in it, details. All of this stuff here is parameterized. It's not fundamental equations. It's parameters that represent things that we can't put in as fundamental equations. It increases the uncertainty in some respects, but it's probably a real representation of uncertainty. So in some senses, climate models have become more variable, more dispersed, but that's getting to be a more accurate representation of our unknowns. But you can see it's not converging toward an answer. If anything, it's diverging. Climate models will never be perfect because the scale issues are prohibitive. So the spatial differences alone, those planetary waves you saw in the climate simulation are thousands of kilometers, so 10 to the 7 meter. The scale of the ice particles that make up a cloud and those dynamics really determine the radiative properties of the cloud are a micron, which is 10 to the minus 6 meters. So that's 13 orders of magnitude difference in scale. You cannot make a simulation that reproduces that. The tighter your simulation spatial scale is, also the higher your time resolution has to be of your time steps, because you need to step the model forward in time no greater time than it would take the air and the water to move out of one grid box into another, essentially. So the finer your spatial scale, the finer your temporal scale has to be also. So what about temporal variations? Okay, we need time steps of minutes for these high-res simulations, but we'd like to run these models for thousands of years to capture the whole turnover time of the ocean to equilibrium. So that's 8 orders of magnitude. That would suggest that you have to run 10 to the 8th steps in a climate model and then times all your grid boxes. So the computational demands get very large. Mostly people don't run long models, they run short models, and then they hope to extrapolate, but they don't really know where they're going. Okay, as I said, the uncertainties are predominantly due to clouds. It will never be possible to represent the processes explicitly. We just are not going to do it. We're stuck without uncertainty. We basically have not reduced the uncertainty in climate models for global mean temperature since Arrhenius in 1896, which is fine. I mean, we haven't changed our prediction very much. We just said, there's just this range, we got to deal with the fact that we don't know, right? That's just life. But when we use these models, we always need to ask what information in them is useful and valid. Okay, so what is a climate model good for? Ooh, I hope I can have 10 minutes over because we started late. Okay, so what do climate models do well? In the present day, as you can see from them, like somebody showed this great simulation of atmospheric rivers, they look like the data. If you don't pay a lot of attention to do numerical comparisons, to your eye, it looks very much like actual data. It's realistic, it's representing something physical well. It gets the temperature gradients right, it gets the large scale flows right, it gets the transfer of constituents right, it gets the radiative balance pretty right. Of course, a lot of that's due to jiggering of individual parameters by different groups to make sure it does, but it gets the present day pretty well. When you run them forward in the future across models that also have different modeling choices and different parameter fudges, they have robust projections, and these are very zeroth order physics things. We get increased surface temperature with more CO2, obviously. We get more warming at the poles and the equator, especially in the north because the South Pole lags a little bit. We get increased like I said, the atmosphere gets more opaque to radiation, so we get more transfer of heat upwards by latent heat, by water vapor, which means what goes up must come down, so we have more water coming down, so we have more precipitation. All the models produce this universally. It is also true regionally. We can see that some dry areas get drier, and that's also quite true across models and has a fairly simple physical explanation, very reduced form. We tend to see that Hadley cell, the wet to dry transition, gets wider, so the wet band in the middle of the tropics gets wider, and the models robustly reproduce that, and we're starting to pick that up in observations as well, so this is something they do well. And then, since the gradient in temperature has decreased, and one thing I didn't tell you when I showed you those wiggles, the reason they're spatially correlated is that those wiggles are mostly just motion. Temperature, the atmospheric temperature has an adjustment timescale of about a month. When you see things changing on timescales of days, the atmosphere, the individual molecules are not changing temperature that much, they're moving to somewhere else. So a lot of the variability we see is simply a function of motion. That means if the gradient between where it was cold and where it was warm suddenly becomes less, then air moving from the cold place to the warm place has less contrast, and we'll see less variability, right? We don't care in Chicago so much if freezing air comes down from Canada if Canada is less freezing, right? We don't care so much if warm air comes up from Florida if we're more as warm as Florida now. So the less the gradient is, the less the variability is. So the default prediction is that variability goes down, temperature variability goes down, especially in the winter. Okay. So what do climate models not do well? In the present day, they can't reduce regional temperature spatial distributions. They do not get the temperature at an individual location to be accurate. They do not necessarily get the variability to be correct. They do not get the regional precipitation distribution correct. They absolutely don't get the characteristics of individual rainfall events correct. The precipitation is always too diffuse and too weak. They won't get even the hurricanes right. You have to use a very special model with high resolution to even approach getting a hurricane right, and they're still mostly wrong. And even though we're trying and the modeler groups are doing better and better, they don't necessarily get low frequency oscillations right, which are mostly in the tropics. You have lots of these like ENSO, El Nino, we all know this. Why is that so hard? Because things that happen in the tropics are largely driven by moist convection, which is exactly what the models have a hard time with. The things that happen at high latitudes are driven by large-scale flow. The model is better at that. So the models suck at the tropics. They have wildly different representations of tropical climate, and they have wildly different projections in the tropics. So when the models are all different, their projections are often, sometimes, so certain things quite different. So there's no strong agreement on regional changes in rainfall. There's universal agreement on global changes in rainfall, but not on where it's going to change, other than this general wet get wetter, dry get drier. And there's no agreement on changes in low frequency oscillations, which is becoming more and more clear when we get now, with computational increases, we get more of these long runs. And we can look, and even if they tune to get El Nino kind of right now, they'll have very different El Nino effects in the future. So we can't trust these things from models. But there's a lot that we can trust. Okay. No, it's not advancing. Why are you not advancing? Okay. So what do they not do well? Like I said, they do better at projecting trends than at projecting a base state. So this is I have versions of this figure myself. I just grabbed this off the web from someone else because I was in a hurry. This is how model output is typically presented as temperature anomaly, relative global temperature, the difference from its mean state. Then if you look at the actual mean state, you say, wait a second, the difference in mean state, this is global and it's even worse for local, is almost as big as the trend. So that's an interesting question. So that means for impacts assessment, when your plants really care if they're this temperature or this temperature, you can't use raw model output ever for impacts assessment because the models aren't representing the current state perfectly. But there's something awfully consistent about the trend, right? So then you say, well, maybe I should trust the trend, but not the observation, right? Not the base state, but the trend is meaningful. Some people have thought, oh, we'll just go to higher resolution, we're going to fix all these biases. This is a very complicated figure that you don't need to see all of. It's by a paper that we wrote on agricultural impacts and downscaling, so looking at agricultural yields under different versions of resolution of model. And basically, the models could never get the agricultural yields right unless you somehow adjusted for their bias anyway. And the differences, this is a regionally downscaled model. This is the original course resolution GCM. This is the agricultural yield. This is the summer precip. This is the summer daily maximum temperature. You can see that making it finer resolution changes this pattern of biases. These are biases from observations. So if you increase the resolution, you have a different weird pattern of bias, but it doesn't make the bias go away. So all of these, and this is the bias correction you would have to apply. These are the statistical distributions of the bias correction you have to apply to get it to look like reality. So the base state is pretty good when you look at it without scrutinizing the details, but for the purposes of impacts where 5 degrees matter, it's not good enough, right? So that's, and downscaling doesn't fix the problem. Just for people who say, okay, reanalysis is reality, remember that even the reanalyses are different. So here is a bunch of different reanalyses which are based on observations simulated by models. This is the anomalies year to year over historical, right? These are all historical, right? It's actual observations. But this is the raw value. This is from Gavin Schmidt at Real Climate. So even what we think of as reality, they still vary by, half a degree. So it's less, right? But a reanalysis is not perfect, and you can see that some of them have slightly different variability properties too. They're trying to assimilate observations, but assimilating observations is hard. So again, we're doing great at understanding, but it's just not, the details are not perfect. Okay, so why can we use bias models to do anything with it all? Well, the whole field assumes that the trend projection is more meaningful than the base state. That we say we can detect a trend in global mean temperature of 1.5 degrees, even if our models are disagreeing by 5 degrees in global mean temperature. Right? And so this is just a simple demonstration we did, and the figures are cruddy because we just did this mostly for ourselves and we haven't published it. But this is, we said, let's make a bias versus trend plot of different variables for all the CMIP5 models. And say, so this axis here is, this is the difference in mean. And this is the, so this is, see this right? This is the difference in bias from observations, and this is the future present difference. And this is, right now, this is temperature, but what we've done is we've taken these numbers, the numbers for each grid point, and then averaged them, right? It's not global mean temperature, it's the average of the individual data points. And then this is the same for variability, right? So now we're looking at the standard deviation of temperature, simple definition of variability. And certainly for mean temperature, here's the spread in the bias, and here's the trend, right? So the trend is much more consistent across models than the bias is. In variability, there is a little bit of correlation, but it's not that much. So it doesn't certainly look like the bias is strongly connected to the trend. So the typical assumption in climate science is to say, we can work with the anomaly, we'll trust the trend, we ignore the bias, or we correct for it in some way. Okay, so how do we address model biases for impacts assessment? The standard and traditional way is to do what's called bias correction, which is to somehow take your model output and say, oh, my model output base state is not correct, but I have observations. I will tweak the model until it looks like observations, because I want my model to look better. Then I'm going to assume that bias is constant, correction is constant across time, so I can apply that same correction to my future state. And in the old days, they assumed a simple additive or fractional bias, additive for temperature or fractional for precip. Now people do quantile mapping to try to adjust the whole probability distribution. The problem with that is that, as you saw with these complex spatial temporal dependencies, if the model's not getting those right, when you do quantile mapping, you're still going to get the spatial temporal dependencies wrong. So if you care about these relationships, this is pretty awkward to say I take a model that's wrong and I do a crude correction to try to make it look more right. And so what we asked at U Chicago, and this is primarily Michael Stein who pushed this, he's my partner, spatial statistician, is he said, why is everybody doing this? This is wrong. The thing that we know is correct is the observations. We trust in the model the trend. So why are we trying to fix the base data of the model? Why don't we just take the observations and apply the trend to them? Use what the model is good for and apply that to the observations. So that's what we call a oops, it should have been two, a data-driven simulation. Instead of adjusting the model to match the observations, we adjust the observations to match the model. So what does that mean? We have to do something that we call model emulation. We need to extract some kind of information about how the model is going to respond in terms of trends and changes. And that means extracting a simplified form of that, right? You know, if we want to be able to apply this to arbitrary scenarios, we need to understand how the model responds, and then we can apply those trends to the actual observations. So here's a little cartoon that a grad student made where he says, here's our observations, here's the model baseline, which is off by some amount, here's the future model. So what I need to do in the traditional way, I would say, okay, I'm going to take this bias, I'm going to fix this thing by bringing it down. So I measure this bias here, and then I apply it to the future observations. But if you have variability properties wrong, then you still have them wrong, right? So this is what a bias-corrected model would do, right? It produces a projection that doesn't match up with what we know the observation to be, which is weird, right? So the other method that's used, which is called the delta method, is a version of what we're recommending, is to say, instead of taking the correction and applying it to the model, I figure out this trend and I apply that to the observations. So I push the observations forward, retaining their statistical properties, and just impose a trend on them. So in this case, we haven't used any information from the model about changes in variability. And one of the early talks showed changes in mean, and it had an error term, and the error term was fixed. But we just said that we know from physical assumptions, very simple physical assumptions, that variability changes by a lot, especially in winter. So we have to make it, this is a weird cartoon because it makes the variability go higher in the future. But what we have to do is, again, not this, we have to somehow take what we know the observations to be here, we take the future projection inclusive of variability changes, and we produce a simulation that includes model that takes the observations and applies to them projected changes in means and in variability, right? Some way. And that will give us something that is the most likely to use for impact assessment. So that's what we've been recommending for the purpose of impact assessment, which is not always the same as the purpose of understanding. Okay, so what does it mean to capture the information in the model? We call this statistical emulation. It's a term that's used. Model emulation, the stats community likes to call it, which is a little bit weird to me. So we tend to say statistical emulation. Take a big numerical simulation and make a pre-computed library of runs. Say, I'm going to force it with different external forcings. I'm going to gather a set of behavior. This is very standard in I think, in machine learning also. You have a training set, that are a response. And then you say, I'm going to train and test a statistical model that captures that response. And then I can apply that statistical model to arbitrary scenarios, right? It's just pretty standard kind of approach. But we're assuming that we can take this complexity and reduce it somehow to something that we can capture in a few variables. And not in a black box way, but say I'm going to make a very simple equation. And sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. But it works in a lot of cases. So then this is a bunch of papers that have appeared just in the last 7 years. No, less than 7, like 4 years in this space. Like we did a lot of work, and then suddenly, boom, the papers start coming out. So there's a ton of them, and I can't talk about all of them, and I technically have 5 minutes. So I was going to talk about this work, and now I've mostly introduced it without really talking about it. So I can give you a few snapshots of what we've done. And then I'll just skip the ones that we don't have time for, and if you want to talk more about them, we can talk at the coffee break. But in many cases, we find that the system is easier to represent than the climate scientists had assumed. Because people who make big numerical simulations, they want to say, I need all this complexity. How could you possibly think this could be simple? But there are simple behaviors that emerge from that complexity. And those have been useful for us. Okay, so just to start with, why is it hard to make this emulation at all? It's because the climate does not map one-to-one with the CO2 concentration because of these timescales. If climate mapped to CO2, all you have to do is make a lookup table that says for this CO2 you have this climate state, and it would be fine. But instead, the system is laggy, it's slow, and so the climate state at any given time depends on the entire history and the time series of past CO2 concentrations because it's slowly warming, right? So that's a really annoying property. So this is just a simple test we did where we jack up fairly fast, but it's a linear increase, the CO2 from pre-industrial to 700, and then we watch the temperature follow, and this is year 2000, and here by year 6,000, 4,000 years later, it's kind of almost flattening out, right? And that's global mean temperature. It's different in different places. But you can see that the system is slow to respond. So what we're trying to capture is that time scale, the differential time scale of response across the surface, differential sensitivity and differential time scales across the surface of the Earth. And we say, how can we capture this response given a time series of CO2? What do I do? Okay, so we have a library of training runs, which I won't go into this detail, but you can see that when we started doing this, we decided to make all kinds of different runs, as you would expect. Like, I need to simulate the behavior. I need to push the system in different ways so I can capture all its weird edge effects. So we made very detailed libraries that included lots of different kinds of unphysical runs so that we could really exercise the system. And we also were too panicked to try to do anything on grid scale, so we said we can only emulate on regional scale because we aren't confident enough to do anything else. And that actually worked fine. So we had 7 parameters: temperature, pre-industrial temperature, the current CO2 anomaly, the weighted CO2 history, and a value for the exponential weights, a lag parameter. That's for every grid point. We do them separately. We needed 4 parameters for temperature. For precip, this is a model that this equation has been out there in the literature for other reasons. The pre-industrial precip, what they call a slow term, that's a function of temperature. The physics is not correct. The slow and fast is not the right representation, but the functional form is right. It just doesn't mean what people think it does. So a slow term and a fast term, that's a response to CO2 and a response to the temperature that follows behind. What this is really is the opacity as water vapor is building up in the atmosphere. And this is a combination of the radiative effect of CO2 and the disequilibrium of the heat uptake. But so that's 3 more terms. So we said, okay, I make a statistical model, 4 terms for temperature, 3 terms for precip. These are things that, this is, Michael's like, oh, this is a generic statistical model. Let's try this one. This is the standard model that's used in the literature. We put an error term in that we have to make some assumptions about the structure of the error term, and we fit just fine, right? So here's regional temperatures, North Pacific West, East Pacific West. We picked these because they are an interesting thing. This was a crazy scenario where the temperature goes, the CO2 goes up and then drops. These are not trained on these scenarios, so it was trained on a different set, and then we forced it on these sets and say, let's look at the simulation and compare to reality. So you can see that precip is noisier, temperature is less noisy. That's the characteristic of the system. But we're emulating probably good enough, right? It's not clear that you need more information than this for impacts. And some of these things, like this little tweak here, this is it's a very physical response. You can make that happen in a climate model. You can, by dropping the CO2, you can have increased precip spikes. It's a real phenomenon. Okay, and then we said, what happens if we extend that emulation to the publicly available archives? They don't have wonderful training sets. They have stuff they've designed to be crystal balls, right? Predictions, realistic scenarios, which are smooth and similar, which is, as you guys know, is terrible for training to understand the properties of a model if your training set is all things that are quite similar. But this is what's out there. So if you want to do this as multi-model, you have to use these kinds of scenarios because that's what's in the public archives. It's much more useful if you don't demand that people do a year of modeling runs before they make an emulation. And so it turns out that we can use these we have to reduce some of the terms in the models to make them not so fast. But we can emulate pretty well. Here's just a subsample. Again, it's Western United States. We're not emulating the variability here, but we can capture this different behavior of the model reasonably well. Some models have problems, and that in turn informs us about the models that we can't emulate them. Like this one is a universally problematic model that almost never reproduces. It has weird structure, and so it's a diagnostic, but it doesn't emulate well with that equation. And we discovered that we can emulate at pixel level. This color code here is essentially an error term. It's a goodness of fit compared to noise. This is what we had for this one model. With regional emulation, you can see the big regions. Why is this so bad? Because there's actually different physics. Since we had too big a region, it was trying to merge different physics. When we emulate on the pixel scale, other than certain crazy places that it's also informative that they're crazy, like the desert Southwest is crazy. It tends to be dry places and the edges of precip bands that are weird, and high mountains. Those are the Himalayas. Other than that, the emulation is better. So we can take a model and use these kind of 7 parameters per pixel and do pretty well. So we can give someone a climate model in a box and say, here it is, absent the changes in variability, right? That was our first big thing. Like, you guys do not need to run the whole simulation. Let us give you 7 parameters per pixel, and you can go from there. Then we started, one reminder is that that doesn't work for the long timescales because our training set doesn't include those. You can't train on physics that isn't in your training set. So there are terms that we can't emulate because we don't have long enough. If you had 1,000-year training sets, you could do that. So these kind of approaches will never work for these long time series, but you know, that's a universal problem that people aren't running these models very long anyway. Okay, so I'm going to take 2 more minutes on results, and then I'm going to jump to the conclusions. So you do need to understand the error term. That's variability that matters, and there's all kinds of complexity because the variability should be joint. It's like precip variability and temperature variability go together. We right now are treating them separately. That's not totally fair or physical, but we can do that. As long as we treat them separately, we can come up with reasonable ways of representing them. Just to remind people that the distribution of a variable is not sufficient information for impacts, because people care not just about values, but they care about frequencies. So these 2 time series have the same probability distribution, but something where you have recurrent frequent events is different from having longer blocks of on-off, right? Imagine that this is precip, right? That will have a big flood and then a drought, and a big flood and a drought is different from having a little bit of precip every day, right? So the time scale of variations matters. So when you do this kind of emulation, you have to do it in the frequency domain because the frequency matters to people. So we use spectral analysis, again, as a pretty standard statistical technique. None of this stuff is really high level. In fact, the statistics grad students are like, oh, this is too simple, I'll never get a job, right? I need to do a harder problem mathematically, or else I can't show that I'm getting a job. I can't show that I'm good enough to get a stats job. So we do have this valley of death problem that the statistics students want to work on harder problems than the climate system requires, which is interesting. And maybe that will be so in computation too. You might find that there's all kinds of useful stuff to be done that your grad students won't want to do because it's too easy. But on the other hand, it's too hard for the climate students. So we kind of have this weird lack of the appropriate person to do a lot of the stuff that's really useful. Right, so we need the spectral analysis. Here's just an example of, this is just the standard deviation of temperature in base state model. All it is an example. This is approximately 2-day period. You see more variability over the ocean, over the land than over oceans, which we know is true, right? You go near the coast, the variability goes away. You see more at high latitude than at the equator. The Central Africa is very wet, so it almost looks like the ocean. You know, these are all things that make sense. When you are at low frequency, so this is approximately 3-year period, now you pick up all these tropical oscillations that show up, these low frequency tropical things that the models don't necessarily capture perfectly, but the models do understand that there's low frequency stuff going on in the tropics. And the other things are slightly different. But so there is a frequency specific difference in the base state, and there's frequency specific changes. Again, this is too complicated to totally go into. It's 2 different models. These are 1,000-year, multi-1,000-year runs. This is CCSM3 on the top, GISS on the bottom, daily data. This is annual mean variability, which is not a particularly useful quantity to actually represent because it is different. Like I said, it's more in the changes are more in the winter. So this was kind of a stupid analysis. So we didn't publish it because now we have to go seasonal, but it's a good figure. So CCSM, both the models are showing blue is a decrease, largely decrease in variability over North America, over continental land, largely increase in variability, especially at low frequencies in the tropics. So similar, but also different. So there's useful things. If you can emulate this, you can give people a representation of how different models would project impacts. I won't just show this at all, except to say this is a paper by Andy Popick where he's looking at transient climate states. He's trying to take the GCM difference between present and future. That's the red and the green. So you can see, again, this is variability This is actual temperatures, and you can see the variability in the base state is high in the winter, and then it's a little bit lower in the future in the winter. And then he's taken that information and mapped it onto trends, onto observations, so that he can give a data-driven simulation, which is this green thing of the future, combining observations and model. So that's what we've been trying to get people to do. And the equations for this are in his paper. And it's a simple function he's using of temperature and the rate of temperature change. So we can make these simulations that are reasonably good with fairly straightforward functions that include variability changes and even seasonal differences in variability changes, as long as we're treating variables separately, which is an issue. We don't have to talk about extremes. I want to show this just to show people why not to trust models, especially on precip. So we have a whole series of work led by Wan Cheng, who's now faculty in statistics at University of Cincinnati, looking at how to represent precipitation variability changes. And in this case, we can't just look at time series because it's so non-Gaussian. The only logical way to look at precip is as events, right? To say it's a spatial temporal event, it appears, it goes away, what are the characteristics of that event? So the statisticians don't like that because it's not standard. It's basically image processing, which is more like a CS thing, but it's the only reasonable way to look at it. So what this is his second paper, and he's developed an identification and tracking algorithm that accounts for all the precip and just groups it into events. And he's looking at NCEP, reanalysis, which is very coarse, right? This is not realistic at all. This is not how precip actually looks. This is how precip really looks. This is observations, rain gauge, radar-based observations with correction from rain gauges. And it's gray here because there's no good data on California. But you can see this is one particular 6-hour period during June, July 2005, when we had, by coincidence, we had a colleague who had done all these different simulations with slightly different versions of the model, different parameter settings. And this is reality. This is the reanalysis. And then she forced a bunch of regional models with this reanalysis and said, okay, here's my high resolution regional model. What does it look like? Does it match reality? And the answer is, well, it kind of does. It's the same day. It's the same conditions. I mean, you can see this is one of the hurricanes. This is Hurricane Dennis in 2005. But boy, the precip is pretty different, right? If you live here, this is very different, right? There's more precip in these models, and there's much bigger areas of precip. This 4-kilometer model has resolved convection. It's better than the others, although, to what extent we really can say it's better. Is it physically better? Is it coincidentally better? It certainly looks more like observations. We couldn't do any of this without this identification and tracking algorithm to have some kind of metrics, right? So he's grouping the precip into these categories. So this is something that you could do, these kind of event identification. You can do that with machine learning. But in this case, we can just make just a definition, right? Just a deterministic definition. We use that same algorithm to apply to the future, even though we say, okay, the models suck, but what is their trend? Is the trend meaningful and interesting? We know there's going to be changes in precip because the intensity of precipitation goes up by more than its mean, which is a fundamental property of the climate system, really zeroth order physics. So something else has to give. Either there's fewer storms, or they last less long, or they're smaller. And what we found is that this model, anyway, shrinks the storms, which is of interest, right? I'm going to skip over this. The precip gets much simpler when you're at monthly time scale. But so this is the kind of impacts relevant stuff that we can do. We can so far do this with simple statistics. When we get to something beyond these simple definitions, then we're going to need more techniques. And that's why this machine learning for fronts was really interesting. Okay, I'm going to skip all this. So what can machine learning help with? These are just some random thoughts from the last day and a half. Maybe they're bad thoughts. You can tell me if they're good thoughts or bad thoughts. These are the things that seem most interesting to me. Beyond, I know we need to do attribution, and I just am not personally that interested in it. But obviously, we need to do attribution too. Model validation studies, the single most important thing to me. Nobody mentioned it. Like, the models and the observations are not the same. How are they not the same? The climate science is terrible at diagnostics of model evaluation. Like, in this precip paper here, we were proposing these radically new measures of like precipitation size and extent and duration. Like, no one has put those in model evaluation before. They make evaluations on mean precip amount, right? So there's all kinds of features that are informative about where the models are going wrong that aren't being used right now. And some of them we can think of, and some of them probably come out of machine learning. And that seems really important to say, where are the patterns that are different? Maybe there's things I didn't even expect. And from those patterns, I can infer something about model physics. So that seems like a huge area. The other thing is, as people mentioned, identification and tracking of complex features. We can do cyclones. We can even do regular rain events. But fronts, those things are hard. There's lots of other multivariable things that are complicated. That's a great thing where we'd rather have a deterministic definition, but it might be too hard. Emerging properties, new patterns of change. That doesn't mean it's enough to say there's a pattern of change, but once we have a pattern of change, then we can try to understand why it is, right? And the big area that feels really underserved to me is not the climate models themselves, but is the geostationary satellite images, especially of clouds. Because I study clouds in my experimental life, and the way that we treat discussion of historical cloud properties is basically we talk about total cloud fraction of low, medium, and high cloud, and that's it. You look at an image, it's got all kinds of features and structure and tortuosity and spacing between different cloud types. We don't characterize any of that because we didn't have the computational techniques when we started 20 years ago, and so we never tried. So now there's like 30 years of satellite observations, totally unclassified with all these interested image processing characteristics. We have a grad student in computer science working on this now. One guy, he could probably use help. He's smart, but he's not smart enough to do this all by himself. This is a big area. Oops. And the last thing is something I was talking to Andy about, is what we call impacts-relevant extremes definitions. Climate scientists tend to use really simple definitions of extremes. We're like, oh, the maximum temperature in a given year, that's an extreme, and then I'm going to do extreme value theory to look at its distribution. Why do we care about the maximum temperature in a year? That may be totally irrelevant to any sort of impact that matters to humans. So living in the Midwest is like the farmers in the Midwest really, really care about sustained heat exactly when the corn is flowering. That's what kills them. If it's hot in February, they really don't care. If it's hot after the corn is flowered, they don't care. They care that 1 week. That's important to them. The cherry farmers also care about heat during 1 week, but it's a different week. It's when the cherry trees are blooming. I don't know what other sectors care about. And I went to the National Climate Assessment meeting and I said, what are the metrics of extremes that you care about? And they didn't have a list. So there is no list. So maybe somebody should be looking at economic data and climate data and saying, where are their patterns? Which are the climate patterns that produce economic impacts? And then the climate people can be working on those. So that is something that I just feel like the field needs to go forward. Anyway, I'm sorry that was long. But there's a lot of stuff I would love to do with people here.
Great. So this is a perfect segue into the panel discussion we're going to do now. I think you actually covered a lot of the types